Hello, everybody. I'm Howie Hawkins. I was the Green Party and Socialist Party candidate for president in 2020. And this podcast, Green Socialist Notes, is about continuing to advance and educate and organize around the eco-socialist program that Angela Walker and I ran on. So I'm going to have some comments about what's been going on in the news, and then we'll get to questions and answers. One big news this week is that the court in the United Kingdom said that Julian Assange can be extradited to the United States. Now, Assange still has an appeal, but we have to recognize that the prosecution of Assange is the prosecution of freedom of the press. He's not even an American. I mean, if they get away with this, journalists all over the world have to worry about the U.S. going after them. Because what did Assange do? He exposed U.S. war crimes, and that's what our establishment is concerned about. Trump brought the charges, but Biden is continuing them. And the hypocrisy of the Democrats' rhetoric about defending human rights and democracy just reeks in this case. They're prosecuting the journalist because he exposed war crimes, not that we should stop the war crimes. And I haven't even heard one progressive Democrat call for the charges against Assange to be dropped this week after the extradition decision. But I don't think that's really surprising because they can't even fight the fascists here at home who are threatening our democratic elections. I mean, when is any Democrat going to finally indict Donald Trump? I mean, these January 6th hearings have documented more thoroughly than, I even thought they'd be able to, that Trump's, official lawyers and staff told him he was full of it when he said the election was stolen and there was massive election fraud. And instead, Trump relied on crazies like Rudy Giuliani and the pillow guy, who told Trump what he wanted to hear and the rationale he wanted to have. So then Trump went out, and this came out in the hearings, and he raised hundreds of millions of dollars based on a lie for a so-called elections defense fund, which actually was never set up. The money went to Trump's own PAC, which is his slush fund he's used for travel and donation to organizations that support him and candidates that support him. And then this week, David K. Johnston, who's now a law professor at Syracuse University here in Syracuse, New York, but was a long-time reporter for the New York Times Pulitzer Prize winner. He used the phrase I've been using, that the Democrats are feckless. And he was talking about how none of these Democratic prosecutors have really gone after Trump on criminal charges. He cited the Attorney General in the District of Columbia, who had Trump on the misuse of tens of millions of dollars from the inaugural committee. And instead of going for a conviction, he settled for a small fine. And then here in New York State, the new Manhattan district attorney just dropped the bank and insurance fraud cases where they've got the damn paperwork. I mean, they can show the case, but he dropped them. His two top prosecutors resigned in protest because they said we do have the evidence. And then the Democratic governor, Kathy Hochul, could give that case to another prosecutor like the Attorney General, Tish James, but she hasn't. And Tish James hasn't asked for the case. So you wonder what the hell is going on. And then there's Merrick Garland, the Attorney General of the United States, who has given wrist slaps to most of the insurrectionists they brought up on charges for storming Congress on January 6th. But they haven't gone after the big fish. And Merrick Garland is, being asked about this. He says, well, he's watching the January 6th hearings. They have enormous investigative powers. And you just wonder, are they ever going to get around? They're going after Trump and the big fish around him. In fact, the only prosecutor who's a Democrat who's going after Trump is Fani Willis, who's the DA in Fulton County, Georgia, Atlanta. And of course, that's the case where Trump, and we got the phone recording, he's asking the Secretary of State, Brad Raffensperger, to steal the election for Trump by just adding more votes to his total. I forget the number. I just need 17,000 X number of votes, and I win this thing. And, Trump's still walking around free on that, although a grand jury is now looking at that evidence. So, for her trouble, she's getting death threats. Maybe that's what's held back some of these Democrats from doing much more on Trump. And I can tell you, I know from being out there petitioning in April and May that there are a lot of people that are really angry with the Democrats for letting Trump, who tried to overthrow the government, still walk around free. I mean, they're wondering what the hell is going on. And, that may explain why, the polls say there's low voter enthusiasm among Democrats for this upcoming midterms, even though it might mean a Republican takeover of Congress. These people are like, doesn't make any difference what I do. They're just totally alienated and disgusted. So speaking of the petitioning, all 7 independent nominating petitions for governor in New York were objected to by the chair of the Democratic Party's minions in the Nassau County Democrats, where that chair, Jay Jacobs, is also the chair. And none of the petitions had the 45,000 signatures needed. We all submitted them. Well, actually, one Republican claimed something like 54,000 signatures, but the objections state that they just photocopied, pages and stuck them back in the petition. We've had, that's how Jimmy McMillan, the rent is too damn high, got on one year, and then he got caught another year. But when you remove those photocopied petitions, even that Republican who had millions of dollars to pay people to go out and signatures couldn't get it done. The Greens, we only got 7,967 in the 42-day petitioning period. I say only, that's pretty, that's a lot of work. Richard Winger at Ballot Access News has pointed out that in 2020, no petition for any office in the country for an independent nomination that was 5,000 signatures or more was successful. So, it's not an easy task to get on a ballot. And now that's on the one hand, it's a lot of work. On the other hand, it's about a third of what we got in 1998 when we first got a candidate on a ballot, and in the 2000s when we got candidates on the ballot who didn't get enough votes to get us a permanent ballot line. So, why is that? Well, I think partly, our Green Party petition skills and experience have eroded because we were on the ballot for a decade. And I think we made a mistake of not hiring a full-time petition coordinator. We just tried to hire petitions with a volunteer coordinator. And in the past, we had a full-time coordinator. I think that's a mistake we made because we really needed somebody to stay on top of the people we were hiring and also the volunteers and checking in on the locals and encouraging them and reporting back to us how we were doing. We just didn't have that. So we were kind of flying blind without coordination. I think another factor is, the Green Party base has been eroded between the push of Trump and the pull of Sanders into the Democratic Party. I mean, all of us in our locals know people who went to the Democratic Party because Trump got elected and Sanders looked pretty good. So that's hurt us. I think also in the last couple of years, COVID and the lockdowns and the restrictions have weakened our local organizations because we haven't been meeting much, or more importantly, acting together, out in the community because there haven't been many public events. So that left us a weaker base of people to go out and petition. And it didn't help that as we started our petitioning, upstate New York, my city of Syracuse, was the epicenter of this latest Omicron wave. And so, and I found this out petitioning, a lot of people would say, stay away from me. I don't want to get Omicron. I don't want to get COVID. So it was a difficult time. Now, this coming week, the Libertarians and the Greens have a lawsuit we've been pursuing, which has a lot of arguments. We're going to court this week for a motion to put us on the ballot because we're the third and fourth largest parties in the nation, and none of the independent petitions got on. So at least the judge should put us on in the interest of justice. Frankly, I'm not optimistic, but we're still fighting for ballot access. And we will continue raising our issues. As I said in the release, I think I linked to last week, not being on the ballots hurts us, but it's not going to stop us. Another piece of news this week is with the EU leading the way on behalf of the pharmaceutical companies and the U.S. fecklessly following, the WTO blocked a proposal to waive COVID patents. And that proposal has been around for a couple of years from India and South Africa. Those two countries didn't even see the final text of the statement that was released by the WTO before it was released. I mean, it's just the WTO bureaucracy really doesn't have much respect for the countries that are part of the WTO and democracy. And it was that official text was pushed through, even though more than 100 member nations objected to it. And Biden stated last May 2021, that he supported a patent waiver by the WTO, but he's done nothing about it. And we know from documents and people off the record letting reporters know that behind the scenes, we didn't want it to happen. And Biden still has authorities under the Defense Production Act and U.S. patent law to waive these patents so we can radically lower the cost of vaccinating people in the poorer countries of the global south. And if we don't do that, these new variants are going to evolve and come back to bite us. And, COVID is not much in the news right now, but if you look at, the rate of cases and deaths, we're still in the middle of this thing. Instead, the Biden administration, following the lead of the Republican, is just pretending that the COVID pandemic is over. Remember what Trump said, it's going to go away like a miracle. And it seems to be the way Biden is handling it. But the fact is, almost 99%, except for a few small areas in the US, live in areas with high or substantial rates of COVID transmission. I mean, even Dr. Fauci got it this week. Over 2,000 Americans died from COVID last week. And of course, the science is clear. The public health measures recommended vaccines reduce the severity of COVID. They reduce the rates of infection and therefore transmission. And masking reduces transmission. But there's no big push for vaccines now. Masking is like passe, not doing that. So the Democrats have basically adopted the Trump policy early on when he said it's going to go away. And this is all at the behest of business interests. Government and the corporate media have followed their lead because they want things to go back to normal. They want people to come out and shop. But if you want to keep up on what's going on with COVID, because there's not much in the media, there's a website called the People's CDC. And it tries to keep people up to date. It's very critical of how the CDC, the official CDC, has capitulated to business interests. And that should go in the chat. It's peoplescdc.org. And I recommend you check that out. And, you want to know what's going on, that's a good place to look. And then we had a study come out this week that if we had Medicare for all and everybody had access to healthcare when they needed it, we could have saved 338,000 deaths from COVID. And this was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences. So we could have saved over a third of the COVID deaths if we'd had universal health care. And what happened is people get COVID, but they wait because they're worried about bills. They're not well insured or insured at all. And they also weren't treating comorbidities like type 2 diabetes. And so they became more vulnerable. And we know that 100 million Americans have medical debts. That's another piece of news that's come out. I think that was the week before. This study also found that the bureaucratic inefficiencies of our multi-payer private and public mixed system wasted $500 billion that could have been put into, healthcare for those that aren't covered well or at all. And we would have saved, 338,000 lives according to this study. So, the neglect, that's why I was saying during the campaign, inequality kills, because people don't have access to health care. And then there's a lot of despair out there, higher rates of drug abuse and alcoholism and suicide, because people, become hopeless because of the savage inequalities of our economic system. But the government has no problem wasting money on the military. This week, and this was Thursday, the Senate Armed Service Committee voted to add an additional $45 billion to the military budget on top of the $813 billion that Biden had already asked for, which brings the total to $858 billion for next year. And, the original request that Biden put in there was a $31 billion increase from our current level of $782 billion. And that is already higher than in inflation adjusted dollars than any military budget since World War II. And, it's not like we're fighting this world war. We are occupying the world with over 800 military bases. And that's expensive. And that's what that's really about. And that's not about defending our security. That's about defending the profits of global corporations based in the US. And it's also a boondoggle for the military industrial complex. 55% of our military spending goes to private contractors, arms manufacturers, obviously, but also service providers like food and custodial services and housing services. They used to be done in-house by the military. So this privatization and neoliberalism is extended to the military, to the Pentagon as well. So this is about corporate profits, not our security. And if we wanted to focus on security, we would tackle climate change and inequality and COVID. That's where we'd be putting the money, and it wouldn't be that expensive. I mean, U.S. PERG pointed out, well over a year ago that we could vaccinate the world even without the patent waivers being waived, or the patents being waived, for $25 billion. That's less than 3% of the current military budget. And as I've said during the campaign, and I still say, the U.S. should be the world's humanitarian superpower and make friends instead of enemies by helping other countries. And that would do more for peace and security than this military madness that we're in. And then the last thing I'll comment on is inflation, because, the Fed raised interest rates 0.75% this week, or announced they're doing that. And that's not going to remedy the causes of the current inflation. I mean, one cause is just pent-up worldwide demand from 2 years of the pandemic and the lockdowns, which caused a shortage in goods and services. And, that raised the prices because, the demand is high and the supply is low. Then you got Russia's war against Ukraine, which has caused a rise in oil, gas, and food prices. Raising interest rates isn't going to deal with that. And then we have good documentation that monopolistic big businesses that dominate their markets have the pricing power, are pushing up prices using the inflationary environment as a cover. And so, so that raising interest rates doesn't deal with that. What raising interest rates does do is it raises the cost of borrowing for consumers and businesses, which is going to slow the economy, raise unemployment, and decrease wages. But wages aren't driving this inflation. Wages are increasing slower at a lower rate than inflation. And we know the share of profits of national income is growing, but wages are shrinking as a percentage of the national income. So, what the Fed is doing just is like, it's like a carpenter with a hammer and they think everything's a nail. And they're using an old policy that is just not applicable in this situation, which raises the question of what can we do? Well, if supply is low, we can use the public sector spending to increase supply, and particularly in those areas where it's low. And we've been talking about this with the Green New Deal and increasing renewable energy, which once it's built, it's at lower cost than these fossil fuels. Once you've got a solar collector or a wind generator, you don't have to buy the fuel every month. So it's going to be cheaper once that clean energy infrastructure is in place. So that's one thing we could be doing. We can regulate prices. We do have utility commissions and other, rent control here in New York and those kinds of commissions. We can extend that to deal with the problematic areas of gasoline prices and food prices and rents. In the past, during World War II, we used price controls and rationing successfully. So there are options. And, we can socialize production too. The fossil fuel sector is the top candidate. And then we can set oil and gas prices. The oil and gas we use in the transition to clean energy, we can set them at a level that people can afford, or we can, give people a ration of, how much they can buy at one price before it goes over that price because they're consuming excess amounts. And then have that socialized oil and gas sector reinvest the earnings from selling oil and gas in renewables and accelerate the clean energy transition. The other obvious case is the health sector. Single payer public system is more efficient, so we'll get more people covered and more health services delivered for the same price when we have a single public payer system. And that single system can negotiate with the drug companies who, rip off Americans for drug prices because they've got a law that bans Medicare from negotiating with the drug companies. That's something that could be done right away. Or probably better would be to just take the pharmaceutical companies over because they aren't doing basic research to deal with diseases. They're looking for the next Viagra or, very high profit drug that people need to take all the time. And so we might as well take them over because we're paying for their research anyway and have them run as not-for-profit utilities for public benefit instead of private profit. So there are options to dealing with this inflation, but the Fed is going to raise interest rates, and I don't hear much strong criticism, except from a few progressive Democrats from the two-party system, with what the Fed is doing. But that's all we're going to get under Biden or under a Republican Congress in 2022 or a Republican president in 2024, which is looking more and more likely. So, it doesn't look good for the economy. I think we got to, as individuals, do what we need to do to protect ourselves from a period of stagflation. And the better way to protect ourselves is to build a movement to change the damn system that's, just taking it out on the poor and working people of this country. So I'll stop there and look for your questions and answers. Actually, let me start before I get to Frankie Lee, which is a good question about inflation. Santino Musto, who's a regular on these podcasts but couldn't be on today, put a question on Facebook, which I think is a good question we need to address. He says, why do you think Black voters chose Biden in the 2020 Democratic primaries and like him so much when he has a pretty racist past? The African-American community knocked Bernie out of the race in favor of Biden on Super Tuesday. Also, how can we draw more Black voters to the socialist movement? Well, the first part of that question, why did Black voters choose Biden? Because they thought he had a better chance of beating Trump. And that's what Black leaders like James Clyburn, who has influence with particularly the pastors in the South, who have influence over a lot of their voters. That's what they did. This was not so much a positive vote for Biden as a negative vote against Trump. And particularly younger Black voters like what Bernie Sanders was saying, but a lot of them didn't want to take the risk that he couldn't beat Trump. I think that's why so many Black voters chose Biden over Trump. I mean, Biden over Sanders. It was all about Trump. And we felt that too, running as independents against both Trump and Biden. A lot of people didn't like Biden, but they weren't voting for us because they wanted to stop Trump, so they voted for Biden. Well, I think that's a dynamic that went there. And, the next part was the American community knocked Bernie out of the race in favor of Biden. I wouldn't give them all the responsibility because the Democratic establishment, remember, they closed ranks that weekend after Biden showed he could win with Clyburn's support South Carolina. All the Democratic candidates, except maybe Jennifer or Elizabeth Warren, for maybe a few more days, they lined up with Biden. And it was a united front against Sanders. So, and I think Black voters, as well as even, progressive voters of all backgrounds, took that as a cue. This is the only way we're going to beat Trump. So I think that was a dynamic at play there. And then the last part is, how can we draw more Black voters to the socialist movement? I think that's got to be done by organization. I mean, you can have great arguments. And if you look at the public opinion polls, Black voters are the most supportive of the kind of socialist demands we have, like Medicare for all, the job guarantee, relieving student debt. And they vote more on those issues than an ism like socialism. But the way to get people, whether they're Black or anything else, is to be engaged with them face to face in the community, and getting a level of familiarity and trust, so where then you can start talking about, a socialist analysis of this capitalist system, and the Democratic Party and so forth. And so it comes back to having a grassroots organization, a party with a grassroots organized base. And okay, the question got posted in the chat. So that's my answer, Santino, and thanks for asking it. And there's the question for everybody else to see now. So the last part is we got to organize local green parties that go out and talk to people and are active on the issues in the community and draw people in on the basis of activity around issues. That's how people first get engaged in politics. And then as they get experience and they're trying to figure out, well, why are we having problems? Like, why isn't everybody for universal health care? And they find out most people are, but then why won't the Democrats, who claim to be for it, or a lot of them here in New York, they certainly do, not implement it? Here in New York, they've had both chambers of the state legislature since 2018 and said if we got the Senate, then it had passed the Assembly many times, we'd get it passed. And it hasn't got out of committee since then. We've had similar experiences where both houses of the state legislature and the governorship were controlled by the Democrats, and they promised a single payer Medicare for all type system in their states. And then suddenly when they had the power, they wouldn't do it. It was Hawaii, California, Vermont, New York. So that, if you're involved in a movement and you're saying, well, why is that? And well, one of the reasons is the insurance industry is a big backer of the Democratic Party, particularly when they're on the verge of passing single payer. And that, money talks. And so that gives you an analysis of the political system. And then who are the capitalists that back this thing? And then you begin to get a class analysis. And so I think that's how you get people into a socialist movement with a socialist analysis and perspective. It's the initial contact is around issues where people are feeling the pinch. And then you have an organization that has education as well as activism. And that's how you build a movement. I'm waiting for it. Okay. Scout Trooper 164. What is your response to Biden saying we have the strongest economy? I guess he's saying we're stronger than Europe. He claimed that our inflation rate is not as bad as Europe. Actually, you look at it, we're kind of in the middle of the pack. So that's just politics. Biden is just trying to, say we're doing better than you think, and, don't give us such a hard time. But, in my little analysis of inflation, you can see you don't have real answers. And he's accommodating the right wing of his party, the Joe Manchins and Kristen Sinemas and the Republicans. I mean, this guy still wants to do bipartisan legislation with a party that tried to overthrow his election. So that's my response to Biden. You gotta fight for a different position, and instead of trying to accommodate your right, because they're going to say thank you very much and then undermine the modest reforms you were trying to get passed. Frankie Lee, Howie, how can we set price controls with rich donors against them? The same way we beat the rich on a lot of issues. We just got to out-organize them. And, in the last analysis, the politicians listen to their donors more than their voters, except when their voters are organized and making themselves heard by voting for what they want. And, if it's going to cost voters because they won't support single-payer health care, which is popular. Price controls, there's education we got to do on that. Just what happened during World War II is unknown. It's not taught in certainly high school economics, not college economics, which is mostly, neoclassical, neoliberal kind of perspective. So there's a lot of education to do on price controls, but whether it's price controls or universal public health care or cutting the military budget or getting student debt relieved, these are things we got to organize and make the politicians we got pay if they don't do what we say. And the best way to make them pay is to vote for an independent left party like the Greens, because that shows up in the vote. And if we get enough votes, then they got to listen, at least look at what we got. I've often argued, and I'll say it again, when I got 5% of the vote running against Andrew Cuomo for governor in 2014, that was the year he was trying to run up the vote, get more than his daddy, Mario Cuomo, ever got for governor, more than he got in 2010 when he was first elected. He wanted to get ready to run for president and make that overwhelming vote one of his credentials, and he got less votes. And he had to look at, well, what was the Greens demanding? Why did people vote for the Greens? Well, we wanted a ban on fracking, a $15 minimum wage, paid family leave, and a lot of other things. But those three things, he moved on those issues. He never supported them before that election. So we were able to leverage. So what I'm saying is, yeah, the rich donors are always trying to buy what they want, but we have power too. Our vote, our numbers, and politicians, whether it's politicians of our own that we elect or politicians that are in there that want to get reelected, we got leverage over them too. And we don't always beat the rich, but sometimes we can. Violet at Content Boutique. Howie, can you explain the neoliberal agenda? More about privatization? Well, neoliberal agenda really got going in the 70s. And it was a response to what had happened in the post-war period when there was kind of a treaty of peace between labor and capital. And in Europe and the United States, a lot of social programs were implemented, particularly in Europe, national health insurance, labor rights, labor organization. There was assumption that when we were more unionized, that unions would negotiate wage increases and improvements in benefits and working conditions. But toward the end of the 60s, the profit rate started to decline after the post-war boom. And by the mid 70s, early 70s, business was getting organized. There was a famous memo by Lewis Powell, who became one of Nixon appointees to the Supreme Court, that was saying, we can't run this country with, environmentalists and Black people and women sitting at the table making decisions. We gotta fight back against that. And his top villain was Ralph Nader, who was pushing for regulation, like of the auto companies and seatbelts and airbags and that kind of thing. And Powell saw that as we got to get rid of all that. So neoliberalism was about deregulation, about privatizing public services, about deregulating trade in particular, having a world market, but also about the state supporting big business with subsidies and lower taxes and that kind of thing. So it was a whole cluster of policies that featured deregulation and marketization of public sector services on the one hand, but also a strong state that supported big business. And that's what we've had now dominant for the last 50 years. And, the popularity of Sanders or Corbyn in Britain there for a period shows that there's still a lot of people that want at least a more regulated capitalism with social benefits and social supports from the state. And in this country, I think a lot of Democrats think that's what the Democratic Party still stands for, even though for the last 50 years it hasn't, because you have the legacy of the New Deal and, the FDR to Johnson period. And even though that reality has changed, the Democrats rely on that rhetoric. And when Bernie Sanders actually ran on that program very openly, he was very popular. So the neoliberal agenda was never popular, but it was certainly implemented. And that's what it was about: privatization, deregulation, state support for big business. And, here we are with more inequality than we had in that. Inequality was reduced between the 30s and about 1970, and then it's been steadily increasing ever since. So that's what we got with neoliberalism. Beth Graham, Sanders performed well in his debate with Graham. That's Lindsey Graham. He was tough. I wish he was that tough in his presidential debate with Biden. I haven't seen the debate with Lindsey Graham. I read a little bit about it. And Bernie, I've seen him, since the 70s. He's a good debater. He can be tough when he wants to. And the thing with Biden was he was so concerned about not damaging Biden if he won the primaries to fight Trump. I mean, Sanders' biggest thing was getting rid of Trump. And so, he did pull his punches with Biden, and it obscured the differences between them. And I wish he'd been as honest with and tough with Biden as he'd been with Graham. But Bernie has pretty much decided he's going to be the left wing of the Democratic Party. He's not going to really challenge the two-party system and the way it maintains, neoliberal capitalist rule in this country. Justice V, any thoughts about Rhode Island becoming the fourth state to require all public elementary and secondary schools that teach at least one unit of AANHPI history and culture? So what does that stand for? African American, Native, Hispanic, Pacific Islander? I think that's what that acronym is for. And I think it's good. I mean, in New York, we have a requirement for, it's diversity, equality, inclusion, I think is what it stands for, that, requires some of that instruction. I think that's very important now, so that you don't get, people like this kid down in the southern tier in New York that went to Buffalo to kill Black people, living in a, segregated white community, susceptible to all the racist tropes about Black people and buying into this so-called replacement theory. That's what happens when people are ignorant. They're not getting educated in schools about our real history and the contributions of all ethnic groups to the development of this country. The abuse that some ethnic groups have most of them at some point in the history have experienced. And so that's really important. And it's a big fight because the right is going after, curriculum that deal with our racial history. And and they want to burn books or ban books. And so they're basically pushing ignorance. And that's where things like racism thrive. You need to shed light on it. And that should be done in the public schools. So I didn't know particularly about what Rhode Island has done, but it sounds like the right step. Eric Gray, how would you go about building a community ecosystem for education in our society? I assume you mean like a community movement for quality education, high-level education for all students, a broad curriculum. Well, I think, this is where school board elections are important. It's where, particularly parents who are most interested get involved in their school boards. And, this is where the Green Party is a well-organized local organization, can have a big influence on those kind of debates about schools in our communities. So for me, and I don't care whether you're talking about reforming the labor movement or dealing with any other issue, without a political party with a broad perspective and orientation, not just an issue by issue, single issue perspective, that's what we need to do well on all these issues. The problem with the single issue perspective is then even progressive movements, they're competing for attention, for money, and the participation of people. If what a political party can do is bring those movements together around a common program and a common strategy for dealing with all the issues. And that's, so for me, it comes back to what's missing in this country is a left party. We got two capitalist parties and then a bunch of single issue progressive movements that are largely dependent these days on capitalists because they're led by nonprofits, membership organizations, whether a party or anything else, like unions, have weakened. So, building a community ecosystem or movement. I think it goes back to, organizing a local party that can in, intervene in the education issue as well as the other issues facing the community and link those issues together around a common program and strategy for dealing with them. Eric Gray, I mean, in terms of making sure that teacher shortages are less likely with time. Okay, well, that I guess there are two sides to that. One is teachers are underpaid, and we got to make sure uh, the profession is seen as worth getting into. Um, and then I think it's a cultural shift where teachers get more respect than they get, are more valued by the community. Because right now you see this in a lot of these school fights. Teachers get scapegoated for issues that they are not responsible for. So I think again, your movement's got to include the teachers and the parents, and when people are working together, then they can see each other's perspectives and include them in it. So that's what I can say about the teacher shortage issue. We need pay and we need community support. Garrett Wasserman, Howie, did you see the Department of Energy announce new air heat pump tech that still works efficiently even in U.S. cold climates? Expecting commercialized in 2024. How do we get heat pumps everywhere? I didn't see the announcement about new technology. I mean, the heat pumps, like the solar panels and the wind generators, are improving at an exponential rate, and the costs are going down. And if a new technology is going to be commercialized in a couple of years and it's more efficient, great. But how do we get heat pumps everywhere? We got to have a Green New Deal where the public sector finances upfront the retrofitting of buildings, both home residences and commercial and industrial buildings, so they can get the heat pumps now and pay for it over time through the savings they will generate, because paying for the electricity to run heat pumps costs less than paying for the fuels to run gas furnaces. So, that's basically it. We need to finance it up front. And, that's another way to deal with this inflation problem. When we get to those heat pumps, it's going to lower the cost of heating and cooling buildings. And let's make the upfront investment now and have the consumers pay at a rate they can afford. And over time, the whole project will be paid for. Linda Templin, is there a state-based version of the Green New Deal? In my state, there are about 15 to 20 DSA candidates to our state legislature saying they want a Green New Deal. If we had a suite of bills, we could push for those. Well, in New York, as an example, trying to remember the name of the coalition, we had a dozen bills that would fill out a clean energy transition. We have a bill called the Climate Leadership and Community Protection Act, which is weaker than the one the Greens were advocating in the 2018 campaign. That was called Off Fossil Fuels. We had a faster timeline. We had bigger investments. We had a more progressive and steeper carbon tax. We had more community control of implementation to disadvantaged communities. I mean, our thing said people that live in those disadvantaged communities should be on the climate justice boards, whereas the other bill that passed says people representing those communities, which means the non-profiteers. So, those upper middle class people are going to get paid. So we had a much better bill. But even with the weaker bill we got a dozen bills. One was for expanding the power of the New York Power Authority, one of the largest public power agencies in the country, to build renewable wind and solar projects, which they can't do now. That was opposed by both the utility industry and the private solar and wind industry. Has a lot of support, didn't pass the legislature. We had bills to tax the rich, to invest more in the energy transition. One bill that did pass was a 2-year moratorium on crypto mining with fossil fuels. The Greens support that, but we want a much stronger bill. We want to ban crypto mining, even with renewable energy, because we need that renewable energy to make the transportation and buildings and manufacturing sectors clean energy. And we can't waste the clean energy we do have on crypto mining, which is a bubble anyway. So I would suggest looking in New York. I'm trying to remember the name of the damn coalition that pushed those bills. But I think with some Googling, you'll find, a lot of legislation that you could use to pick up on. Yeah, but that's a suite of bills. So my best recommendation is check out what we have going on in New York. And I just wish I could remember that coalition. The problem with, nonprofits kind of drove this, and every year they come up with a new name and a new coalition, and I can't keep them all straight. But you should be able to find them, and if you need to, contact me directly, and I'll dig that name up for you. Deminton, will someone explain a heat pump to me? Is it like steam power? No, it's like a refrigerator. A refrigerator, inside the refrigerator, they push the hot air out and it cools what's inside the refrigerator. So a heat pump is the opposite. You can run it both ways. In the wintertime, you move the cold air outside and let the energy you have heat up the building. And then in the summertime, you reverse that. So you pull the heat out of the building and it cools the building. And so it's run by electricity. It's the same technology that we use in refrigerators. And if you Google heat pump, there should be some nice graphic, simple explanations that will help you understand the technology better. But just think of a refrigerator on the window that in the wintertime pushes the cold air out and uses what energy there is in the atmosphere to heat up what is pulled in. And in the summertime, it reverses that. So the hot air is pushed out, and the cool air, the heat energy, cools the building because the hot air has been pushed out. Mr. Anderson, the question with climate change is, are we already in a positive feedback loop? Is the releasing of trapped methane in the Arctic is an unknown factor in current models? Well, I think current models have tried to include that feedback from, methane that's trapped in the permafrost and underneath the Arctic Ocean. But they've apparently underestimated how fast that positive feedback loop goes, because the faster as things warm up and methane is released, that accelerates the warming. So you get more methane released. And we have another positive feedback loop. They just had a new study come out this week related to the Barents Ocean, which is between Greenland and Scandinavia. And they're finding that Arctic Ocean is heating up. What is it? It's like 6 degrees Fahrenheit above its pre-industrial temperature. And most of that has come in recent years, because once the ocean ice and snow melts, it doesn't reflect back into the atmosphere heat from solar radiation, which means it's absorbed by the dark ocean. And the more it's absorbed, the more the ocean melts or warms up, and then the more the ice melts, and the more the ice melts, the more the ocean warms up. That's a positive feedback loop. So there are a number that are already playing out as the planet heats up. And so, that tells us we're in a dire straits. And, the sooner we act and do real, serious, radical stuff, the more we will mitigate what is already built into the climate system. And it's going to be a problem that we're going to have to adapt to. Scout Trooper 164, what do you think of Putin raking in oil profits? Well, I don't think it's good, because Putin, uses that to finance his war machine and his very authoritarian state. That's another reason to get off oil. What do you think of an Obama advisor believing that Biden is too old to run for re-election? Um, yeah, I'm trying to remember which one said that. Um, I think Biden's going to have a tough time getting reelected, and um, I don't think it's age per se. Um, people say he does these gaffes and he's getting old, but he's always done gaffes. He's somebody who overcame stuttering, so um, I don't think his mental status has eroded that much. Although he is getting up there, and everybody slows down at that age, but I don't think it's the biggest problem. I think the biggest problem is he hasn't got much to show for his first 2 years when he had slim but actual majorities in both the House and the Senate. Um, and then his strategy of trying to do bipartisan legislation with the Republicans. I mean, they just punked him on that. Um, so I think his biggest problem is not his age, it's his record. And he never was the most inspiring politician anyway. So I don't think he's going to recover support because he's charismatic and enthusiastic and fighting for things. Um, so I think he's in trouble. And I'm not recalling or didn't see what the advisor said, but I think age is probably the least of Biden's problems politically. Andrew Hager, on the subject of COVID, what more can we do to further assist in the fight against Omicron variants? Oh man. I think we need to be talking about COVID is still here. We need to take public health measures. They're talking about needing to update the vaccines, like they have to update flu vaccines every year because the virus changes. Um, the federal government is not funding uh, Omicron public health measures. The fact that you could get the vaccines for free is now in jeopardy. So that funding for Omicron, they throw in all this money at the military, but they can't find 10 or 15 billion to support the public health fight against Omicron. So I think maybe that, at the federal level, that's the first thing. We got to demand funding to fight Omicron, uh, and particularly in the form of vaccines. And then I think we got to criticize the way the Democrats, like the Republicans, have just walked away, pretending that Omicron's going or COVID has gone away. It's still very much with us, and new variants are evolving. The world is not vaccinated. We are still in the middle of this pandemic. So I think, we need to do public education on that. And I know people are tired of COVID, but, as I've said, I know Fauci said this, people may want to be done with COVID, but COVID is not done with us. And if we don't, deal with COVID, it's going to deal with us and it's not going to be good. We've had 1 million people die and, much higher rate than most industrial countries. Um, it's amazing that, that many people can die and, people are just sort of shrugging about it. Um, in this Omicron period, I've known more people got Omicron or got COVID than they did during the original COVID or the Delta periods. So, and another thing that people are not paying enough attention to, or there's not enough reporting on it, is long COVID. Even if you don't have serious symptoms when you deal with the virus, it can, be in your body, and long COVID can affect your lungs, your brain, other organs for a long time, and they can degenerate. And so this is a very serious disease. And the way we're just trying to pretend it's gone away is just insane. So I think education and demanding more public funding to fight COVID. Eric Gray, thoughts on mutual aid and the strategy to focus more on direct action as opposed to elections? I don't want to counterpose direct action to elections. You can be out there demonstrating, but if you're not giving people an alternative to vote for in elections, the Democrats, who you're basically lobbying with your protests, can take it for granted. Because what are you going to do? Take your votes to the Republicans? No. So in the end, they just care about votes from us. So we got to do both. And to counterpose them is an unproductive demonstration. I mean, all our locals should be both engaged in issue work all year round and then be running candidates in elections around those issues. They complement each other, they strengthen both sides of that strategy. So that would be my thoughts on that. And mutual aid. I mean, being out there in the community, helping people, that's a good way to build relationships and trust. So that's part of the picture too. But don't counterpose it to elections, because if we're not running in elections, the whole system can just ignore us. Oh, great, you're going out and doing charity work that the public sector should provide those services or those goods. And you protest, you're concerned about something, and all you get is lip service. Like, look at what happened after the George Floyd protests. There's a lot of talk about police reform, criminal justice reform, and not much action. And now what do we got? We got a backlash with the Republicans or the Democrats tailing the Republicans with a law and order strategy, more money for the cops, and no real reform of the police, like removing qualified immunity so that officers are subject to the same criminal sanctions than any of us are when we assault people. So yeah, don't counterpose movement and party. They or elections and community action. They got to go together, or neither will be effective. Indie Chip Terry. Hey Howie, I'm curious to see how you feel about Marxists involved in the Green Party. It's a scary name for some, but dialectical materialism has always been my main foundation. Yeah, that's an area where we need more education. I think one of the weaknesses of the Greens over the years has been we're very activist oriented, whether it's issue campaigns or running in elections. We need an education component. That's partly helping to build the movement, because I believe people come to movements because they want to take action on issues. They also want to learn. And you can't really understand what's going on in the world without having encountered Marx and his theories, whether it's about independent working class political action or how the capitalist system works. And so, yeah, it's a scary name because we have had a culture of red baiting and demonizing Marxism by people that don't know the first thing about it, or if they do, they distort it. So I think people with a Marxist perspective should be involved in the Green Party. I mean, where else, if they really want to see a mass party on the left, are they going to go? There's nobody else out there really in a position to organize and build that. So, as far as I'm concerned, Marxists are welcome. I think all of us, whatever ideological perspective, should come in with an idea that we're here to educate, not dominate. In other words, you want to win people to your political perspective by persuasion, not bureaucratic manipulations, which often happens in politics, not just on the left, but it also is not good for the movement. So that's what I feel about that. And that's one. Oh, here we go. Beloved community. I admire the Poor People's Campaign, which is having a march and rally today in DC. There is strong labor participation. Should Greens work with the Poor People's Campaign? I don't have a problem with it. I think it partly depends on your local manifestation. At the national level, they are de facto oriented to the Democratic Party. They're, formally a nonprofit organization. They can't be partisan, but their activities are basically mobilizing people to vote against, Trump and the Republicans, which makes it, our standing in those movements a little more difficult. But if you're there and engaged in their activities, whatever it is, whether it's around lowering rents or pushing for a job guarantee or all the things that in the People's Party, Poor People's Campaign platform, I think what we should be doing is building relationships with the activists in that movement, and that way they'll have respect for the Green Party and give us our due when we're working in coalitions. One problem I've had over the years is In contrast to the 1968 Poor People's Campaign that Martin Luther King initiated, they had half a dozen demands: an economic bill of rights, including a job guarantee, a guaranteed income above poverty, big investments in housing and education, and laws to fight discrimination. Or maybe leaving out one of the demands, but it was a smaller set of demands that uh, everybody could grasp. The Poor People's Campaign platform is good. I don't have any argument with most of what it says, but it's long. You can't like encapsulate it. And what the Poor People's Campaign did in '68. I mean, King's intention was to shut down or disrupt Congress from the Resurrection City encampment on the Washington Mall until Congress acted on those demands. What we have now is much more amorphous, less confrontational. So I'm just saying, this is not, Martin Luther King's Poor People's Campaign. On the other hand, they're pushing for a lot of good demands, and there are a lot of good people involved. So, yeah, I think we should work with them. So that's my answer to that question. So we've done our hour this week. I appreciate people being here. I hope my answers to your questions were helpful. And I keep coming back to the same thing. What's missing in the politics of this country, if we want to make progress, is a mass party on the left. And that's not going to be built until we build it at our grassroots. So I hope everyone is thinking about or already engaged in a local chapter of the Green Party, or a local party that is the same idea, because those are going to be the legs of a national mass party. And we're in a period where those kind of membership organizations have dwindled. Whether it's the unions or social organizations like the Masons, or actually the only kind of membership organizations that have stuck around are things like the American Legion and the National Rifle Association. So the right still has something of a base, and of course they got their evangelical churches. The left doesn't. We've got to find each other in our communities and organize around that. So that's my urge to people is, get involved in organizing. If you have a local Green Party chapter, get involved. If don't, try to organize one. And if you have questions on that, contact us, and we'll help you with what we know. So I think that's the task. We're facing a dark period. If things don't change, and it's hard to see where they might. We're facing a Republican Congress the next 2 years, and who knows who we're going to have for president. So we got to build a movement from the bottom up, because there's nothing at the top that can challenge that from the Democratic Party, which too many progressives are still relying on. So good luck, and let's fight back. Have a good week.